The King's Indian defense. This is my favourite way to play against d4. Now, literally, just as I sat down to make a video, Curious Kitsune Fox, you commented that you are uncomfortable against d4. So I figured, change of plan, let's do it on the King's Indian instead. So if there's anything anyone wants to see me cover, pop it in the comments, I am more than happy to cover it. But we will have a little look at the main line, some of the basic ideas, and then some games throughout history where people have fallen into big old traps in the King's Indian. So let's get into it. Now, normally against d4, what you're going to see is the d5 and then the c4, the Queen's Gambit. I'm not a huge fan of playing into the Queen's Gambit. I much prefer horsey out to the f6. This is the Indian. Now, for the King's Indian, what you'll see is the c4 come down, pawn goes up to the c6, just making room for the Fianchetto, horsey out to the c3, and then we do the Fianchetto. And then after this pawn comes down on the e4, you can see they are planning on pushing this down. So d6 just mitigates that. So now if they do the push, then after the exchange, queen takes, horsey back, and then the horsey up to the e4, and black's just in a better position here. We have this pawn as a target, we have full control of this diagonal. This pawn's just kind of out in the middle of nowhere, and while it's protected at the moment, it is going to be a target, and the king's just kind of there, you know, like all the pieces are on the back. It's just a better position for black there. But normally what you will see instead of the exchange is just the horsey coming down, just adding in that extra layer. But we can quite happily get castled off nice and safe, and this is the main kind of setup that we're looking for. Now, I mean, you can see we are giving up control of the centre, but this is a hyper-modern kind of opening, and that's very, very common. But what we're doing is giving up control of the centre, but taking some really great control of the diagonals. And we have some really good ideas here. You know, the bishop's going to come out for this pin, and then the horsey will come to the d7, and we'll have plans of a pawn break with either the e5 or the c5, something like that. A real fun line is the exchange variation, and to be honest, it feels like a bit of a rush to the end game, you know, like the bishop comes out to the e2, and then we do the pawn break really early with the e5, do the exchange, and then after the queen trade, we now have the rook on this open file here. Horsey takes the pawn, we take the pawn, do the horsey exchange, and then we take this, and it's just absolutely wild. Now, you can see we have great control of this diagonal, we have some really good movement for this bishop here, we can start looking at pushing forwards these pawns here, it's just absolutely wild, I love it. But let's have a little look at some actual games and some fun traps. Right, so here we have a game between Norman in the white and Vidmar in the black. I'll play out the opening just for this one, and then we'll kind of skip it from there. Just kind of want to drill it home. So we have the d4, and then the horsey comes up for the Indian. c4, whoopsie daisy. c4 comes down, and we go for the Fianchetto after the horsey comes out. Then when the pawn comes down, we push forwards the d6, just stopping this from coming on, and then horsey comes out, we get castled off, and in this case the bishop comes out to the d3 there. So black brings across his bishop to the g4, going for the pin, and white is like, nah mate, and brings down the h3 to kick us out. Now, obviously we're not going to bring back the bishop, because after the pawn comes down, congratulations, we've just lost a bishop. So really, white is absolutely fine offering up the trade. This horsey is in a pretty commanding position. I mean, you can see there's quite a lot going on this e5, and doing a pawn break later on might potentially be an idea. It's also protecting this pawn here on the d4, so offering up the trade not only weakens off white's command of the e5, it also weakens off this pawn here. So jumping up the horsey to the c6 is now threatening to take this. And if it gets there, we're threatening the queen, we're threatening this, all kinds of shenanigans. So the bishop comes down to the e3. Now, a fairly common move that you're going to see in the King's Indian is the horsey rerouting down to the d7. And you can see these guys are kind of teaming up on the e5 there, just in case we do want to do a pawn push, but also it's freeing open the bishop on this diagonal here. And from here, white makes the terrible move of rerouting his horsey around to the d7 there. And you can just see that very delayed analysis bar there just jump up in black's favour, because black has the wonderful move of hopping up his horsey to the e5. Now, yes, it looks like we are just giving up the horsey, but once the horsey goes and captures back, white just resigns in this position. Horsey is threatening the queen, threatening the bishop, so the queen has to move out of the way. Once we get the bishop, putting the king into check, king moves out of the way, we then go ahead and then grab that pawn, and you can see we're now threatening this. We've now completely opened up that diagonal. It is a massive advantage to black there, so absolutely wonderful play. Right, so for our next game, we have Wittgenstein in the white and Atkinson in the black, and the bishop smashes out to the g5 there. This is a very common move. We don't really have to worry too much about it at the moment. We can just get castled off nice and safe there. And normally when they do that, what you're going to see is the queen coming to the d2. What their plan is to bring the bishop to there. And what they're hoping for, so let's just say, I don't know, let's just make a move, it doesn't really matter. They come to there, and what they're hoping is that we go ahead and take, and then the queen can come down, and then eventually they'll look at, you know, kicking our horsey out of the way, getting theirs out, and then coming to here and trying to go for the mate. Super common. Or alternatively, let's just say we make a different move, like bring out the horsey, then they're just looking to get rid of our bishop and then get rid of our control of that diagonal there. Super common. Now, one thing that I do fairly often when they come across like this is I just bring my rook across to here, to the e8. And then when they come down, we can just shimmy back the bishop, and that way we still have full control of that centre and ain't nobody getting into that square there. But in this game, how it plays out is the queen comes down to the d2, and then black goes for the pawn break with the c5. And from here, things get a little bit exchange crazy. So there's the pawn exchange, the queen exchange, but this allows black to get the rook on the open file. Then the bishop exchanges off with the horsey, but this is now allowing the full control of that diagonal. So horsey jumps down to try and threaten the bishop. Now, bishop can go and take, but really once the rook comes across to here, it's not really achieving too much. So black just hops up the horsey to the c6, allowing this exchange to happen, but also it's now allowing the horsey to threaten jumping to here with plans of, whoopsie daisy, this fork. Now, what looks like a good developmental move is actually terrible. Like I say, black wants to hop the horsey here, white decides they want to stop it, so brings the horsey to the e2. Look at that analysis bar there, because horsey can now jump instead to here, to the b4. Now, why is this so threatening? Well, you can see we are obviously threatening the fork. That's a fairly obvious one. But let's just say he decides to move out of the way to something like this. That is just a mate in one. It will be exactly the same if he hopped to here, or if he, you know, tried to push the pawn, anything like that. It's going to be the same. Instead, white decides to bring across the rook to here onto the c1. However, horsey can just jump up, threaten the king, and white resigns, because if he was to just say move to there, and then after this, black just has a huge advantage here. It is essentially game over for white, and white is only going to win if black does something absolutely catastrophic. Right, let's have a little look at some games where things go wrong for black, because it's always important to learn from mistakes, and I'd rather you'd learn from others' mistakes than learn from your own. So we have white coming out with the f3. This is Bill Wall, the author of the fantastic book 700 Opening Traps. Black gets castled off. This is Gant, I'm not sure with the first name. And then the h3 comes down. Now clearly the h3 is to try and stop this from happening. So instead, black decides to go for the b6. So bishop comes out to the d3 and he goes for that c5 pawn push. Now, as you can see, analysis bar, not a huge fan of it. Stockfish much prefers this pawn break here on the e5, and then d5 comes down, and it's still a little bit cramped, but it's not too bad. But like I say, I can see what he was going for. The problem with c5 is they may not go for that exchange. Instead, they could push down the e5 like so, and then after the exchange, horsey really should be dropping back to somewhere like here, but as you can see, this rook is just ever so exposed. When he hops down to the d7 there, bishop comes across to the e4 and black just resigns because this guy is just falling. There is not too much he can do about it. Just to play it out, it would be like, you know, horsey takes, and then after this, and then comes down like that. And it is just, everything is in white's favour there. Can do the queen exchange maybe, but like I say, even so, white is 4 points of material ahead here. So how could black avoid this? Well, let's just bring it back all the way to here. So instead of doing this, could just do this. Bring the e5 straight up. And yeah, the d5's going to come down. And if you're not a huge fan of closed games, might be a bit of an issue. But really, it's not too bad. These 2 pawns will end up being a bit of a target for us. And, you know, we can be looking at rerouting the horsey like this, something like that. Or even bringing the horsey around to here, to the h5 there. With plans of, like, hopping here eventually. Things would have been considerably more comfortable. Alright, so here we have Atkins in the white and Conde in the black. So, white comes down with the f4. This is the 4 pawns attack, and this is how I like to play against the King's Indian. From a psychological perspective, it is very scary just seeing all of these pawns raining down on you, and while it's not the end of the world for black, it's quite scary to look at. Now black gets castled off to safety, and the horse develops out to the f3 there, and then the rook comes across to the e8, just in case there's any kind of pawn breaks. And I imagine this is what black's plan was, but after the bishop comes across, just making a bit of room there, horsey comes out to the d7. Now, this is a huge mistake. I can see black's thought process. They're planning on the pawn break, and they just want as much as they can in there. The problem with this is, this e5 is inevitable. Absolutely inevitable. And it would be real nice if the horsey could jump to there. When this horsey's here blocking it, this comes down, and things are going to get real uncomfortable real fast for black. So the horsey jumps up to the g4, and then the e6 comes down. Horsey jumps out of the way to the f6, pawn takes, and then the king is forced to take. King's a bit exposed, and he's very vulnerable to this move here. Well, the pawn comes down to the h3, absolutely inevitable just to kick this horsey out of the way. Horsey only has one move. He jumps back to the h6, and then the g4 comes down. He's now being threatened by this. He's been threatened by this. Things are catastrophic for black there. Now, black clearly wants to try and save one of his horses. Really, what you should be doing is just moving the king back to here because of this, and just letting this happen. And while it's not ideal, it is much better than this move here that black makes. Horsey to the d7, because this is no longer coming down. This horsey comes down, and in this position, black just resigns, because what choices does black have? He moves the king out of the way to here, and then the fork, the queen falls. If he moves the king to here, the queen falls. Whoopsie daisy, the queen falls. Or if he moves the king up to here, that's a checkmate. So how do we avoid this horrendous fate? Well, let's bring it all the way back to here. Right, instead of the rook coming across to the e8, we can just push forward the c5. If he does the exchange there, and then the queen's exchange, things are very comfortable for us. We have the rook on an open file, and we are okay. If this comes down like so, we can just quite happily hop the horsey back to here, and things are absolutely fine for us. We can just quite happily just reroute the horsey around at any point, and we are okay. If instead he pushes down like so, we just push forwards the e6, offer up the trade, and once again we are in a nice and comfortable position there. We'll have plans of hopping up the horsey to here, with looking at maybe something like that, but things are okay for us. Relatively even position. Like I say, the rook across to the e8, while not a terrible move in itself, then it came across like this. Then he could have done the c5, but like I say, this move here is just absolutely catastrophic. Right, I'm going to have to keep this one shorter than usual since I did not prep for the King's Indian. I prepped for a completely different opening, but after that comment, I just thought it would be a good one to look at. We'll look at some more d4 openings as well, just because there's a lot of ways it can play out. But like I say, I just wanted to look at the King's Indian, which is my absolute favourite. You dudes go off, have some fun, play some chess. Like it if you like it, comment anything you want to see me cover, and subscribe if you really like it. Catch you later.